And then lastly, we're just going to use a simple model to sort of explore what drives changes in the price rent ratio to see how that's changed over time. So what are we going to find? We're going to find that in the 2000s, the true price rent ratio. So the price rent ratio based off of prices and rents on the same properties was actually more volatile than the sort of naive measure. During the housing boom in the 2000s, the prices on renter occupied housing actually grew more than the prices of owner occupied housing. And if you remember, the concern was with the price rent ratio that actually the opposite was happening. That maybe this green line was the only thing increasing and that the red line was staying flat. So we didn't need to be worried. Because the red line and the blue line are what we're measuring the price rent ratio off of. But in fact, what we see in the 2000 housing is that the price of renter occupied housing is actually increasing more than the price of owner occupied housing. And it fell more in the bus. And so the price rent ratio, as measured in our data, is actually more volatile, increased more and fell more than the naive measure used in the FOMC meeting. Yes.
Sorry, just for a clarifying question, you referred to the renter occupied housing and like the price changes. Are you looking at all like multifamily, asset classes, or are you isolating the single family to make it more apples?
Right. So we'll come back to that. We look by property type. In our data, we're trying to look at something that's comparable to the owner occupied housing stock. So we're looking especially at single family rentals. But what you do see is a similar increase in cap rates, which is what is the equivalent of price rent ratios for commercial real estate, right? So for multifamily property, you see a similar pattern for cap rates over time. And so there have to be stories told, well, if there wasn't a relaxation in credit constraints for people to buy owner occupied housing, maybe there was a relaxation in credit constraints that allowed investors to buy rental properties. And maybe that's what was driving the 2000 housing boom. But actually what you see, even if you look at very large multifamily properties, which are bought by investors who are really not like, there was no change in credit constraints that people can point to that was really affecting these sort of large investors. It had the same pattern, which points to the fact that everyone was sort of had similar beliefs about what the future income would be of those properties. Okay.
There is also another measurement issue that the properties that are being traded, the prices are based on people who buy and sell. Or
absolutely, 100%. Yes, absolutely. And that's part of why I think this price, the price of renter occupied housing is more volatile. It's partially because of that measurement issue.
It's the same for both, right?
It's the same for both, but what we know from all the research that's been done on foreclosures from post the foreclosure crisis is that despite people's fear, especially mortgage lenders' fear that people would strategically default, meaning like abandon their houses if they owed substantially more than what the house was worth, that was relatively uncommon. Then there's been a very interesting survey paper put out by someone who works at the CFPB recently, showing that effectively the majority of people default on their mortgages because of some sort of life event. They lose their job, they get divorced, they get sick and have healthcare bills. So what happened during the foreclosure crisis was that a lot of people lost their jobs and couldn't afford to make their mortgage payments. Relatively few people stopped making their payments because they were underwater on their mortgages. Sure, some of the people that stopped making were also underwater, but it wasn't.
I'm talking about something slightly different. That
no, so
houses that are being transacted are just a very small fraction of what's.
Yeah, my point was just like when you're looking at the price of owner-occupied housing, these are people that are moving to a new home, right? When you're looking at renter-occupied housing, a landlord doesn't have to move to sell their homes. And so while there was very little while there wasn't much strategic default in the owner-occupied space, there's no reason to suspect that there wasn't in the renter-occupied space because landlords don't have the same incentives, right? They will not keep a property if it's not making enough income for them to sustain that property. And so what I think is partially what's driving this sort of volatility in the price of renter-occupied housing is the fact that landlords who came in, bought at the peak, were relying on those capital gains to sustain that property investment. When those didn't come, when those didn't materialize, they sold.
Yeah.
Whereas owner occupiers, even when they buy at a peak, a lot of them kept those properties. And so you just
Yeah.
didn't have the same volatility.
Yeah,
There's a similar
actually, I was thinking about the difference between prices and rents.
Oh,
Because-
yeah,
Because in prices, you see like 8% of the population every year on average.
yeah, you could have a similar issue where you get sort of a better selection of rental transactions going over time. I should say. The rental data we use is from the multiple listing service, like I got into that in a moment. It's also not representative. It also has its own issues. But again, I have this paper showing that the BLS housing survey sample actually shows very similar rent growth to MLS. Which is using for, which is a random sample, but yes, I take your point, yes.
Maybe you'll get to this and you can put me on. I'm going to, but it seems to me like in the recent growth, like the patterns of rental demand really varied across the country, depending on, you know, like this exodus from New York City that we heard about, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So do you kind of get into some of the geographic? Okay.
Now we'll get into the geographic area. Okay, so one, the price rent ratio, the true price rent ratio was more volatile than the naive measure. Two, the change in price of owner occupied housing was mostly due to changes in the price of renter occupied housing. So most of the most changes in the price of owner occupied housing was due to the price of change in the price of rent ratio. So I'll get back to that decomposition in a minute. And then the price of renter occupied housing rose more than the price of owner occupied housing in the boom and fell more than us. By contrast, today, what we see is that the price of owner occupied housing is driven mostly by rent growth and inflation. And that actually the price of owner occupied housing today has increased more than slightly more relative to the price of renter occupied housing. Which makes sense if you think that today there's sort of a relative higher demand for more space, homes in suburbs. Right, because no matter what we do, there's going to be some sort of characteristic differences between renter occupied housing and owner occupied housing. And as people have worked from home and required more space and been more likely to want to own a large space with enough bedrooms and enough offices, this sort of like makes intuitive sense that the price of owner occupied housing would increase slightly more than the price of renter occupied. Okay. So just quickly going through the data, what we use is the CoreLogic real estate data. So that has information from public records, which is deed stick data. So any transaction of real property is recorded there. Then we use data from the multiple listing service that has listings of help sales and rental listings, which is where we get our rent information from. We use tax assessor files as well to get information on property taxes. And whenever we're looking at rental growth, we're netting out property taxes. So it should be sort of from an investor's perspective, to the best of our ability, we're looking at net rental income of that property. And then we use the property IDs created by CoreLogic to sort of match these different data sets. And we create 4 different data sets. So we will create one data set that is the prices of owner occupied properties. A second is the price of renter occupied properties. I'll get into how we identify those in a second. A third, which is rents. And a fourth, which is matched price rent ratios. So prices and rents on the same properties. These are some summary statistics. So the match sample, the way we do that is we take our MLS data on rental listings and we look at properties that sold and rented within 1 year on either end. That gives us a price for which that property sold for and a rent for which it rented for. Also, the MLS data gives us another source of price rent ratios, which is that there's a lot of small investor properties listed on it, including some single family homes, including some sort of 2 to 4 unit buildings, where they give you the net rental income in the listing. And so we also use that to supplement our match sample. And then we also look to answer the question about large multifamilies. We also use real capital analytics, which has a property level sample of properties that are worth at least 2.5 million, includes large multifamily properties, and includes the net rental income, and the prices of those. So from those we get sort of a sample of large multifamily properties. Yeah.
Can you distinguish which ones are section 8? Or is it like a big issue?
So I don't think it's a big issue in terms of section 8 because we're using MLS. So MLS on average is gonna be much more expensive units compared to the national average. Is gonna be bigger units than the national average. It's representative to the point, unrepresentative to the point where it's on the higher tier end of properties. And so we don't see directly in MLS whether it's section 8, but I don't think most of them are in there. So I think they're advertised with it via like other mechanisms generally, yes.
And so just the MLS, you would have to be working with a realtor to rent your
Correct,
property.
yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to do 2 different things to decompose our data. So our first is we're going to do a repeat transaction index. So you can kind of ignore the sort of math, but effectively what we're doing is we're taking what the standard measure of house price growth is, where you take a property, look at it in 2 different periods of time when it's sold both times, and so we're computing price growth and rent growth using those multiple observations on the same property. And what we're going to do is we're going to run one big regression where we calculate the growth of renter occupied properties, owner occupied properties, and rent growth of renter occupied properties relative to each other. And so what I'm going to show you is this. So what we're omitting is the price of renter occupied properties. So what these lines are showing you, this blue line is showing you the price growth of owner occupied properties relative to the growth of renter occupied properties. What you can see is that in the housing boom, so in the early 2000s, the price of owner occupied properties is growing slightly less than the price of renter occupied properties. During the bust, because the price of renter occupied properties fell more than the price of owner occupied properties, the price of owner occupied properties is growing more relative to the price of renter occupied properties. And then since then, they've been fairly consistent in that they've been growing at fairly similar rates. By contrast, rents were growing much less than the price of renter occupied properties, right? That's why the price rent ratio rose. In contrast, in the bust, again, they grew more than the price of renter occupied properties because those prices changed. And since then, they've been growing at fairly similar rates. And so what we can extract from this are indices. So the price of owner occupied housing grew, fell, and grew again. Rents were fairly stable during the housing boom in the 2000s and the bust, and have since been growing, and especially been growing recently. The ratio of the price of owner occupied housing to the price of renter occupied housing initially fell during the housing boom. That's the relative increase in the price of renter occupied housing. During the bust, that reversed with the price of owner occupied housing rising relative to renter occupied housing, and has then remained fairly stable with a slight increase recently, where the price of owner occupied housing has been growing relative to renter occupied housing. And then the price rent ratio, the true, quote unquote, true price rent ratio. And what you can see is that this decomposes the price of owner occupied housing. So the price of owner occupied housing is just like simple math, like you can just crop these out and grab the price of owner occupied housing. Again, we're just kind of decomposing this in an identity. So the price of owner occupied housing is decomposed into these 3 things: the rent, the price ratio, the price rent ratio. So what you can see is that during the 2000s, the majority of the increase in the price of owner occupied housing was due to the price rent ratio. More recently, in the 2010s, it's been due to the growth in rent. And in the post-COVID, it's been especially due to growth in rent. And I will decompose that again in a better illustration, yes.
So does this, I'm trying to think whether this is independent of the ownership rates. I think about like the entire US economy, let's assume that demographics stay the same. But you have shifts in ownership pretty substantial. Does this is independent of this or not?
So
You're fixing the physical houses.
Yeah.
But the population shifts, right?
So the population shifts, true. I think my bigger not concern, because I don't think it's a big problem, is that you can have transitions in housing units between the 2 types. And so what we can see is that in the late 1990s, if you look at the American Housing Survey, you can see that there was an increase in the transition of houses from renter occupied to owner occupied. And the reverse also happened. And so those housing stocks are not like immutable over time, they are substitutable. And I think that's like a valuable point. And so, and there's of course measurement issues when you have attrition in any samples. If your property.
It's the same how sometimes you, I mean, in general.
Yeah.
You're sometimes doing, I mean, if you had like only data, you would sometimes observe it as a rental and sometimes.
Right. And if it's.
And it's endogenous the way that they move. That's, I think
Yes,
that's.
absolutely.
that's
I don't
something,
think that's
right?
a first order measurement
Yeah.
concern by any means. So I think. Like,
I,
I don't think that's.
I'm not sure, I'm not sure about that, because those that are, I don't know, but those that are, you know, probably you don't have the multi-million homes being rented. Right, it's really the kind of the low end
Yes,
homes that are actually being rented and owned periodically, right? So, and these are the houses. that
right.
people
I mean,
have.
this is a repeat transaction. So within. We're controlling for any unchanged property characteristics.
No, and
So
so
the
if
relative.
there is one that appears one for 5 and then it disappears, you may have
Yes.
moved to that. It's able to make.
Yes, again, I don't think, even that, I don't think is a first order concern for this, because I don't think there's not, even when you look at the AHS, the sort of. The flows between types are low, like relative to the stock. So I don't think that's a first order concern for just tracking price growth over time. Okay,
There is.
Yeah.
I don't really get the intuition why that the owner owns housing price will grow because of the rent growth. Do you have any like intuition for that?
So if you buy, I guess another intuition for it would be if you buy a stock today at a price, right, that's high relative to the current earnings of a company. The implication is that you expect the earnings of that company to increase to drive the increase in that stock price. Right, so like if you have, or if you just imagine a discounted present value formula, like the rent might not change today, but if you think the rent's going to increase 5 years from now, that's going to increase your present value today,
Oh, okay.
right? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so this is maybe a better illustration of what's driving the changes in the price of owner occupied housing over time. So here, the yellow is the price rent ratio. The purple is the changes in the price ratio, so the price of owner occupied relative to renter occupied. The orange is the real rent and the green is inflation. So what you can see is green is like not that important until relatively recently, where we've suddenly seen some inflation. What was really the dominant driver of the price of owner occupied housing over time in the boom and bust was the price rent ratio, the yellow. More recently, the price rent ratio has still played a part, but real rents have played a bigger role. They were in fact like almost non-existent. In fact, like real rents were negative during parts of the boom, but here they're positive and playing a consistent role in the driving price of owner occupied housing. And then we come to 2021. Really, they're driving the majority of things. That plus inflation is driving house prices. It's much like the price rent ratio is up, but it's not driving as much of an increase as those other two factors. Yeah.
Interesting. So rents themselves, you treat them also as kind of, you know, that are linked to inflation, right? I mean, in a way, as a family has, you know, a budget, part is going to education, part travel, part clothing, and part for rent. So there is gravity there, right? It cannot diverge too much from inflation over time.
It can't diverge too much from current demand for housing, is what I think you're saying.
No,
It can,
inflation.
no, it can absolutely diverge.
No, I understand, but not for very long, right? I mean, it's like saying, it cannot be any number. It is constrained by how much a family makes.
Well, different goods have different inflation rates all the time. It all depends about the
In the
microstructure.
long run.
In the
These
long,
are,
in the long run, there will be mean
I
reversion,
mean,
but
the
it-
delta of the real rent cannot be, you know, over 100 years constantly growing, for example, because families will not have enough income to support this.
yes, and there will be more supply. Yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's a component that is likely to refer to.
You mean that the rent growth will come down? Yes, absolutely. We also expect price growth to come back down. I would say eventually. I mean, there's a difference here, I think, between.
No, but by saying that it is not overpriced,
Mhm.
because it comes due to the rent growth, this rent growth is likely to revert in the future, meaning that prices are likely.
Well, okay, there's a difference between levels and growth. So rent levels have gone up. So what I think you're saying is that the growth would have to be negative so that rents would have to fall again.
They will have to catch up with. They will have to catch up with inflation.
Yes, okay, that's fine. But my point is not that that can't happen, which it absolutely can. My point is that what's driving prices today is demand for housing that exists today,
Yeah.
right? That is very contrary to what was happening here. When rents were not increasing, because there wasn't necessarily an increase in demand for housing today, there was an increase in demand for owning a good that you thought would pay off in the future, right? And those are very distinct differences from a policy perspective. The policy implication for today is build more houses. That will lower rents, right? And lower rent growth. The implication here is that asset prices are not in line with fundamentals. And those two are very different. Okay, so what we do is we do a similar exercise using a hedonic model. So effectively, instead of controlling for property characteristics by looking at the same property over in multiple time periods, what we're doing is we're running a regression where we just include a bunch of characteristics of that property on the right-hand side. The purpose is just another way of controlling for heterogeneity in property characteristics. And so what we do is it's the same exercise. We're looking at the relative growth in the price of owner-occupied housing relative to renter-occupied housing, and the rent growth of renter-occupied housing, and we can derive the same indices using this different sort of regression model. The point is just the broader point is that we get broadly similar results, right? The price of owner-occupied housing is being driven by the increase in the price-rent ratio during the boom. More recently, it's rent growth, and we have the same pattern for the price ratio, meaning that the price of renter-occupied housing grew more than owner-occupied housing in the bust and fell more than owner-occupied housing in the boom and fell more in the bust. Okay. So far, what we've done is we've used sort of 3 of those data sets that I described to you at the beginning, where we were looking at our full sample of owner-occupied housing, our full sample of renter-occupied housing, and our full sample of rents. But really, a value added of our measure is that we have this property level price rent ratio. We have not actually looked at that yet. So by definition, these are renter occupied housing because they have rents on those. It's a small sample relative to our full sample of prices and rents, so we can't do a repeat transaction analysis with it. We just don't have enough data. And we also have many observations that are missing hedonics and characteristics that aren't necessarily standard. So what we do to create a price rent ratio based off of this data sample is we do a separate hedonic model, where instead of including hedonics like bedrooms and bathrooms and things, what we do is we include what we have, which is the square foot of the property, a distance to the local central business district, and then a series of effectively fixed effects. What we do is for each city, each CBSA, we draw a grid of that CBSA and include a bunch of controls on the right-hand side that sort of allow the price rent ratio to have a different sort of fundamental value in each location in that CBSA. And so what this does is it just provides us with some additional sort of controls over variation in property characteristics that we can't control for directly because we just don't have that information. So what we do with this is we have a series of, we break it down into a series of different ways. We create city level indices for sure. We create some state ones that I'll get to in a second. We also look by property type. So this is of interest because, again, when we go back to the 2000s housing boom, there was all of this like thought that it was this change in access to home ownership that was driving that boom. But what we see is that it wasn't just single family homes, which is what we think of when we think of owner occupied housing that had an increase in the price to rent ratio. it was really all property types. So these are by definition renter occupied, so we're not looking at owner occupied here. You would think the ones with the highest substitutability to owner occupied would be the single family. But we didn't just see this increase in the price rent ratio among the single family properties, we really see it among all different property types. And I didn't include here the one with the large multi-family properties. But what you see with that one is a very similar increase and a slightly less of a fall during the bust. Okay. Then we also look across state. So across states. So if any of you remember back to the 2000 housing boom, it was largely dominant in a number of states known as the stand states. So Florida, California, Arizona, and Nevada were the ones that had the highest sort of bubble aspects to them in the sense that price growth and price falls were the most prominent there. So we can also see that in our data. So here we're looking at this property level price rent ratio for Florida, which saw the boom and bust. California also saw a boom and bust, although slightly less dramatic in Florida. We look at Arizona similarly. We don't have Nevada, but we have Texas, which does not see as much of an increase in fall in property prices at that time. Again, that's similar in our data. We can also look at Ohio, which is relevant to all of us, which I don't know if you remember. Maybe I'm too old, I don't know. But Ohio didn't really see an increase in house prices in the 2000 boom, but there was a neighborhood outside of Cleveland, or part of Cleveland, that called Lottie Village that got labeled by the New York Times as the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis because it had the highest number of foreclosures per capita in the country. So Ohio did not see a boom, but it saw a bust. And then similarly, another state that was hard hit is Michigan, which is not that far away, where it did not see a boom, but it definitely saw a bust in terms of house prices. So we're pretty confident in that we think that this data set is providing us with pretty intuitive results in terms of the price rent ratio. And yeah.
Another question. So this is identified both for resale transactions, right?
No, so this is, I'm not.
Or I missed.
Yeah, so for when we're using our property level sample of price rent ratios, we don't have enough data to do repeat sale transactions. So what we do is we do a hedonic where.
I see, this is the Hedonic one.
Yes,
Got
this
it.
is the hedonic where we include the grid over each CDSA, and we include a regressor that is effectively the distance from a grid point for each property. And so it's effectively allowing sort of a flexible shape to the gradient of price rent ratios over the space of a city. And that's a way of sort of controlling for property characteristics, because those vary across location within a city, et cetera.
It does assume that the residuals average to zero across the entire sample, right? We're not doing it out of sample, we're doing it in sample.
This is all in sample, correct?
So this means that just makes sense. So if you had like, so the residuals average to zero.
Well, that's, yes, generally the
No,
case.
I understand, but in a way, when you look at the early 2000s, it's like you're kind of through the back door, you're entering the future years. And we can talk about it later.
Okay.
We-
Sounds good. Okay, so what we do next is we sort of discuss different determinants of the price rent ratio. So there's some sort of complicated equations, not that complicated, but bear with me for a second. So in an economic model, when you have a price of a good, it is always relative to another price, right? So if you write down a model where you have housing, you have the price of housing, sort of spot price of housing, which is rent, it should be equal to the marginal utility of housing relative to the marginal utility of whatever other good is in your model, right? That's all that first equation is saying. Our second equation is saying that the rent price ratio should be equal to interest rates plus depreciation plus the growth in your marginal utility of whatever that other good is. Your just general consumption good minus the growth in your marginal utility of housing. And then you can rewrite that a bunch of different ways. Where instead of having these difference in the growth of marginal utility, you replace that with price growth. So this is like for standard user cost formula. Ish, relative to prices. And then you can also write that again, where you, instead of looking at interest rates per se, you break out interest rates into the component of interest rates that affects consumption growth. And the component of interest rate that does not, which is discount rates. So if you break those out, you have that the rent price ratio is based on discount rates, depreciation, and just growth and marginal utility for housing. So that can give you some idea of what can drive the rent price ratio. So for example, population growth. If you have population growth in the short run, so if we're now assume that your housing stock is fixed, you can't build houses tomorrow, then you're gonna have less housing per capita over time, which is gonna drive up your marginal utility. It's gonna drive up the growth rate of your marginal utility for housing, which is gonna result in a decline in your rent price ratio. Supply elasticity. So again, if you're in an area where you can't build, population growth is gonna be even more dramatic. It's gonna have an even greater impact on the rent price ratio. In the time series, it's the main concern is interest rates. So there's been a lot of discussion now about how interest rates are slowing down demand in housing. But not all changes in interest rates affect the rent to price ratio. So if you have changes in interest rates that are offset by changes in your growth and margin utility for other goods, effectively offset by changes in productivity, then those are not going to affect the rent price ratio. The only changes in interest rates that should affect the rent price ratio should be changes in your discount rates. And the intuition for that is that your marginal utility for consumption growth enters your rent. So other changes in interest rate should not just affect the changes in interest rates that result in changes in your marginal utility and consumption should not only affect prices, but also affect rents in a manner that completely offset one another. So the rent price ratio should not change. And I bring that up just because interest rates are used a lot in models for pricing housing. And it's important to understand that they don't always necessarily mean they're not always a fundamental depending on what you're thinking about. And then lastly, credit constraints. So again, the sort of story of the housing boom and bust was driven by credit constraints. But credit constraints don't just affect the level of prices, they affect rents. So like if in our simple model, we're thinking just about people being only renter occupied housing, for example. And so people are limited in how much they can spend on rent. And so if you change that, that changes how much demand there is for housing. If people can suddenly spend more on how much they rent, that will affect rent, and that will affect prices, but it will affect both of them and have no effect on the rent price ratio. If you think of a fancier model where you have two sets of housing, where one's renter occupied and one's owner occupied, even there, if you have if you limit how much people can spend on owning a house, but don't limit how much they can spend on renting a house, you can have sort of crazy effects where if you ease out how much, like the ability of someone to buy a house, they transition into that owner occupied stock. And actually what happens is that what they're doing is transitioning into a smaller house because anyways, it gets kind of nuts, but it's really hard actually to rent down a model where credit constraints affect the rent price ratio. And generally they do not because they affect rents as well as prices. And then lastly, there's just a housing bubble. So increases in beliefs about the future growth in prices, which is equivalent to changes in your beliefs about future rents, right? If you think prices are going to grow, then you should think if that's going to last, that rent will have to also grow to sustain that. That leads to a decline in the rent price ratio, and that's a bubble. Okay. So one feature of the price rent ratio or rent price ratio, I realized I switched. We do that for the rent price ratio is linear in a bunch of stuff, and the price rent ratio is not, which is why in our regressions we look at the rent price ratio. So this is the inverse. The rent price, the dark black line is the inverse of the price rent ratio. So inverse of the price rent ratio. So instead of going increasing during the housing boom in the 2000s, it's falling. Okay. But one feature of it is that prior to the 2021 period where we saw this huge increase in price growth, it was falling over time, or rather the price rent ratio was increasing over time. So one explanation for that is a change in discount rates. And so what a way of measuring discount rates is to look at the earnings price ratio from the stock market. That's sort of a very rough proxy of discount rates. And what you see is if you plot the earnings price ratio over time, along with the rent price ratio, is that during the housing boom and bust, there really wasn't much movement other than these sort of like dramatic periods in the earnings price ratio, right? If you take that as a measure of discount rates, there wasn't much of a change in discount rates. So really that change in the rent price ratio was driven by beliefs about how prices would rent. But if you look throughout the 2010s, there is this decline in the earnings price ratio. And so again, you take that as a measure of discount rates, then that would explain this sort of long run trend and the decline in the rent price ratio, or an increase in its inverse, the price rent ratio. And so that can give you some, there's other papers out there that have sort of like tried to estimate the exact decline in discount rates over time. And they come up with pretty similar measures in terms of like the amount of decline in discount rates. But that can explain at least why there's a sort of longer term trend in the price rent ratio that's been occurring. That does not necessarily mean there's like overvaluation or something.
Well, it could be that this is like what people call the mother of all asset bubbles, right? I mean, that these days everything is driven by low
Discount rates, yes.
Yeah,
But it
doesn't
affects
mean-
everything, not just.
Right, but it doesn't mean that this is not a bubble.
It could be true that just that it's like, there's a bubble in everything. Yes, it is not particular to housing though, right?
Yeah. I
mean, I think you're taking into account, yeah.
It's very hypothetical.
Could house
but
prices
it's
crash
what's going on.
tomorrow? Possibly, yes. I'm not claiming that they can. I'm just saying that the drivers today of the price rent ratio are different than they were in the last decade. That's all. Okay, and then lastly,
Can I,
Yeah.
sorry for, yeah, so in the housing, at least from, I did also research on this, the housing were a lot driven by short-term rates in the early 2000s. It's the ability to take arms at very low rates. When you look at earning price ratio of the stock market, these are long rates. See what I'm saying? It's about whether you could borrow it at an arm adjustable rate mortgage,
yeah,
whereas
well, so I would disagree, because as I just was saying, an arm or like an option arm or any of these sort of fancy like changes in mortgage contracts that people think drove the housing boom and bust
Yeah.
in the 2000s. I don't think those drove them at all. In fact, I think those, like, if you think about places where there's a lot of demand for housing and perhaps like California, take California. In some, I think there is a good argument to be made that prices should be higher in California than they are now. It is a state that has no water, not no water, but it's limited in terms of its like viability to sustain a population. You could make an argument that prices should be even higher in California than they are now. So how do you make houses there affordable? With fancy mortgage contracts. You could give someone the option to use their capital gains on housing in California to make those mortgage payments. That is an option arm. Is effectively allowing people to continuously take money from their house that is gaining in value to continue making a mortgage payment. It's a way of helping access that
we're
hope.
talking about different things. I'm saying.
I
that
don't think
the
it's the
short
same as
rate-
driving the increase in the price rent ratio. Because what should happen is that if you have a change like that that allows access to financing to purchase a home, if there's any amount of substitutability between renter and owner occupied housing, it's going to play out in higher rents as well. And it's not going to affect the price to rent ratio. Okay.
In the essence of time, it'd be great to,
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so the last thing we do is we back out rent growth expectations from our sample. Effectively, we're looking at anything that wasn't explained by something we can control for. And what we can see is that our measure of rent growth expectations implies that there's a huge increase in the 2000s that then fell And then since then, specialty control for our measure of row or discount rates using the price earnings ratio is pretty flat. And then just to conclude, what we do in this paper is we decompose changes in the price of owner occupied housing into these three different components, and we measure those three components. So we decompose it into the price ratio, the price rent ratio, and rent. And so we can show how those three different components contributed to the change in price of owner occupied housing over time. Changes in the price of owner occupied housing in the 2000s were driven by changes in the price rent ratio. But changes in the 2010s were more driven by rent and inflation. Patterns in the price to price ratio are also informative in the sense that like they have some intuitive, there's some intuition there in terms of like what implications for who is selling when. And this entire analysis just has not only has implications for our understanding of the 2000s housing boom, like is because in our understanding of it, it's inconsistent with any relative increase in demand for owner occupied housing. As an explanation for that boom, but it also aids our understanding of why and how house prices are appreciating today. That concludes what I was going to say.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We're pretty much at time, but this was an excellent discussion, I think, and dynamic.